Өнгөрсөн 2 дугаараар доктор Грант нарны гэрэл ямар чухал болохыг тэр дунд нарны хит ягаан туяа, Б туяа буюу UVB туяаг шингэн авах нь хүний биеийн витамин D-гийн үйлдвэрлэлийг нэмэгдүүлж, энэ нь улмаар эрүүл мэндийг огцом сайжруулдаг болохыг шинжлэх ухааны баримттайгаар хуваалцсан билээ. Төгсгөлийн энэ дугаараар витамин D-г нэмэгдүүлэх нь эрүүл мэндийг хэд хэдэн хэсэгт сайжруулдаг болохыг мөн наран дэхийн бусад ач туусын талаар тайлбарлах болно. Доктор Грант болон бас нэгэн судлаачийн хамт Африкийн Америкчууд яагаад ерөнхийдөө витамин D-гийн дутагдaltaй байдаг тухай болон энэ асуудлыг шийдвэрлэвэл тус бүлэг хүмүүсийн эрүүл мэндийн статусыг ерөнхийдөө сайжруулах судалгаан дээр ажиллаж буй юм.
We think this will be a very important paper when published in terms of letting African Americans know that it's very important for them to have higher vitamin D levels. One other thing that's very, very important for we haven't discussed, higher levels of vitamin D are very important during pregnancy, not only from reducing risk of autism, but preterm delivery, preeclampsia, gestation diabetes, low birth weight, etc. Black Americans have twice the rate of preterm delivery as white Americans, and preterm delivery is very expensive. It has a lot of adverse health effects, and also Black Americans have about 10 times the rate of rickets as white Americans, again due to low vitamin D during pregnancy and during nursing. So we hope to get this message out that African Americans and dark-skinned people, Hispanic Americans and dark-skinned people at higher latitudes all need more vitamin D. In terms of autism, there's a little bit of evidence that higher vitamin D levels during pregnancy will reduce the risk of autism. There's also some evidence that treating people who have autism with vitamin D will reduce the core symptoms, the severity of the core symptoms.
Доктор Грантийн бас нэгэн судалгаан дээр витамин D-гийн дутагдал болон ДНХ-д хүрэх гэмтлийн холбоосыг үзүүлсэн байдаг. Тэрээр одоо үнийг тайлбарлана.
Vitamin D can help prevent DNA damage and genetic changes through its antioxidant properties. So it's the free radicals that often cause the damage to DNA. And by reducing the amount of free radicals, that helps preserve the DNA. And that's one of the ways that vitamin D helps reduce the risk of cancer. Cancer is often related to DNA damage and cells that mutate. And so one thing vitamin D does is it goes around and looks at cells and asks them, do you actually belong in this organ? And if you do, we will let you proliferate and multiply. But if you don't, we will ask you to just disintegrate and send your materials back into the body.
Дархлааг сайжруулж амьсгалын замын халдвар төвчнөөс сэргийлдэг болохыг доктор Грант тайлбарласан юм. Одоо дэлгэрэнгүй сонсоцгоё.
It's an interesting story about how it became known that vitamin D fights respiratory infections. So John Cannell, who was the director of the Vitamin D Council in Southern California, and because he liked vitamin D, he made sure that his patients under his care took 5,000 IU of vitamin D per day. Then in 2004-2005, when the influenza season hit, patients in his care were less affected by influenza than patients in other groups. So begin to think, well, we know that influenza is largely seasonal. Is it perhaps because there's less UVB and vitamin D production during winter? So he wrote a hypothesis paper, and I was a co-author on that, saying that the seasonality of influenza may be largely affected by UVB and vitamin D. In 2010, results were published of a clinical trial on vitamin D supplementation of about 1,000 or 1,200 IU per day for school children in Japan. And again, it turns out that the children taking vitamin D had greatly reduced risk of influenza type A. More recently, a meta-analysis of acute respiratory infections found that if you had your vitamin D level above about 10 nanograms per milliliter or 25 nanomoles per liter, you had a greatly reduced risk of developing acute respiratory infections.